it would be a long debate to discuss whether the term war against migrants is adequate. One would need to think of the transformations of war, which is the subject of the current dossier. What is certain is that what we have at work in the Mediterranean and beyond is a mobility conflict, which opposes the policies of closures of European states to the movements and desires of migrants from the global south. And through these policies, European states define migrants as a threat. Just think of Frontex, the European Border Agency, and its risk analysis reports, which assesses the level of threat that migrants' crossings are supposed to constitute for Europe. Furthermore, military means have been deployed to police European borders since the beginning of the 90s, when, in conjunction with the consolidation of freedom of movement within the EU, visas and legal access to European territory was increasingly denied to migrants from the global south. So the Mediterranean frontier in particular has been increasingly militarized, and effectively military operations such as currently EUNAVFOR-Med, the European anti-smuggling operation, are effectively deployed to police the movements of migrants. Finally, just as another military conflict, the policing of migrants, and again, as some might call it, the war against migrants, has generated a large number of deaths. If we think only of the Mediterranean, NGOs have recorded more than 30,000 deaths at the maritime frontier since the beginning of the 90s. I remember, in fact, for example, just to take one example, in April 2015, on the 18th of April 2015 specifically, and the 12th of April, in two separate shipwrecks, 400 and 800 migrants sank in the middle of the Mediterranean. And at the time, MSF denounced these deaths as the product of the retreat of the Mare Nostrum operation, right, the ending of that operation, and denounced these deaths as figures that correspond to a war zone. It's true that if I say border violence, many people might have the image of a border guard, heavily armed, and maybe possibly shooting at migrants seeking to cross the border. But effectively, the majority of migrants' deaths in relation to borders are not the product of this form of direct violence. They're rather the form of a violence that operates in indirect ways, through policies which turn migrants' trajectories into precarious trajectories and turn environments such as the sea, but also the desert or mountains, into hostile environments. And so these are rather forms of indirect violence in which the violence of borders is mediated by elements such as the sea that mediate between these policies and the bodies of migrants. So the more than 30,000 deaths that have been recorded at the maritime frontier have not only occurred at sea, but through the sea, through the becoming lethal of the liquid element. Now, if we just take the figures for 2017, the Mediterranean is the most lethal border zone in the world. More than 3,000 deaths were recorded at the maritime frontier in the Mediterranean in 2017 alone. But if we look also at the desert, which precaritized and illegalized migrants are forced to, many are forced to cross the Saharan desert before, more than 700 migrants' deaths were recorded by the IOM. And it is widely acknowledged that our capacity to monitor the desert is by far insufficient, and that there are most probably many more deaths that go unrecorded. Finally, closer to us, right, just behind the Alps themselves, separating Italy and Western and Northern European countries such as France, Germany, Switzerland, the Alps have become a vast frontier themselves. And in 2017 alone, once again, more than 20 deaths were recorded. Just the other day, a young man from Togo died from hypothermia as he was trying to cross the border between Italy and France. And just a couple of days ago, his body was brought back to his family in Togo. I think, first of all, we need to remember that borders are overdetermined, as some might say. They don't concern all of us in the same way. Yourself and myself, we can cross borders relatively easily as a result of our passports, but also as a result of our skin color. We don't get taken out of queues in front of borders as a result of our skin color. So borders don't concern all people in the same way. And clearly, the migrants who are being precaritized today are those who are designed as unwanted in function of their class, their financial means, and their race, their racialization. Clearly, gender and sexual categories also play an important role. Men and women are not affected by border violence in the same way, and we need only to think about the forms of trafficking that women face, specifically in sexual violence that they face throughout their trajectories. What's really important to see, I think, is the way the exclusion and the violence of borders intersects with the violence of other social boundaries of race and class, and how the violence of borders is only one moment of precaritized trajectories, which start with people fleeing conditions of war, conflict, but also economic and social insecurity, encounter the violence of borders, and encounter forms of precarity or racial violence and police violence as well on European territories.